Okay, so let's talk about some of the non-legislative powers that Congress takes on. We said that their main role is to make laws, but they have some other duties and responsibilities that they must do as well. And so we're going to begin here talking about the amendments to the Constitution. And while this is something we have already covered, want to refresh your memory about how the Constitution gets amended, what percentage of Congress has to propose an amendment. It's more than half, less than 100%. 2/3, good. So we have 2/3 have to vote for proposal. How many have to approve and ratify? We have 2/3 for proposal. We have to have more than that to ratify. 3/4. There we go. So that's something you need to keep in your mind. You need to remember moving forward here. So we're not going to go through all the process of that aspect since we've already talked about it, but these two pieces of information are pretty critical. So they have the responsibility of amending the Constitution when necessary. They also have the responsibility of helping with the electoral process. While this is not the time to have the conversation about the electoral system, we will get to that in the presidency unit, we do need to understand how Congress is involved with the elections and how the Constitution gives them those responsibilities. So we begin with the 12th Amendment, where we have modified the way that we operate our election system. The 12th Amendment, based on our knowledge of learning the amendments earlier, says that we have a different way of electing the number 1 and number 2, president, vice president. So Congress gets to elect the president, the Senate elects the vice president, and they are on separate ballots in an effort to make sure that we have the same members of the same party elected as president and vice president. Helps make our government work more efficiently. So each state has a congressional delegation in the House. So the state of Indiana, we've got 9 members of Congress, 9 members of the House of Representatives. They each work together to come up with one vote, and they are going to listen to the delegates that have voted from the Electoral College. So not all 9 members get to vote however they want to when it comes to the presidential election. The Senate elects the vice president, and each one of the senators, they get one vote, and that's kind of how that 12th Amendment works. Let's move on here. In the 25th Amendment, Congress has to fill any vice president vacancy. Should the vice president resign, get fired, or die, it is up to Congress to fill that vacancy. So typically the president is going to send a nomination to Congress, and both houses have to approve. And all you need is a simple majority of 50% plus 1 in order to get that person's name approved. We've had 2 vice presidents come to the office this way. Can anybody name them? This is random trivia. Might get you on Jeopardy someday. What 2 vice presidents? Can you say what? What president they were under? Yes, if you want to. I might take that as well. No. The question was, what 2 vice presidents have been filled this way? There was a vacancy, the president nominated somebody, and they had to be approved. It was not John Quincy Adams. No, it was not Johnson.
All right.
Think about when a vice president would have had to be replaced. No, 1970s. It was under Nixon. Nixon was president. His vice president resigned. Spiro Agnew decided he was going to be impeached if he didn't resign because of some bribery and wrongdoing. So Gerald Ford was nominated by President Nixon to become the vice president. Then what happened after that? What happened to Nixon? Nixon resigned, which promoted Ford to the presidency, which left another vacancy, which meant that Ford now had to nominate a new vice president, and that was Nelson Rockefeller, I believe. And so those are the only two cases where this has ever actually come into play, but we have had to do that. Now, Congress also has the power of impeachment. So impeachment is the trial to investigate whether or not a elected official has committed a wrongdoing. It could lead to their removal of office, but does not necessarily guarantee that. So the House of Representatives has the responsibility during an impeachment process to serve as the investigators. They will set up committees to start asking questions, to put together arguments, and they will serve as the lawyers in the trial process. The Constitution specifically mentions 4 different events for which the president could be impeached: treason, bribery, high crimes, and misdemeanors. So if it doesn't fit in one of those categories, then it's not something that they're typically going to look at as impeachment. However, it becomes really difficult to define what is a misdemeanor, what is a high crime. And in many cases where arguments have been made toward impeachment, they have tried to make that argument that one of those two would apply. So when we see the case of Andrew Johnson, that was one of those things. They viewed his actions as, I believe it was misdemeanor, violating a court law. When it was Nixon, it was high crimes. With Clinton, I'm not sure which one they argued for on that one. The Senate's job here is to serve as a jury. So they will hear all the arguments from the committees of the House of Representatives, and ultimately they will be the ones to make the decision of whether or not he is guilty in this case, and whether the charges are accurate and upheld. So you've got 100 senators who'll be listening, and each one of them are going to get a vote. The Supreme Court of the United States, Chief Justice will serve as the presiding officer or the judge. The Supreme Court, however, does not make, the justice does not make the decision here. He just makes sure that all of the rules are followed and that everybody is working decently and in order. So in order to be convicted here of whatever crime is being brought before the person, they have to be convicted by a 2/3 vote out of the Senate. So you must have a minimum of 67 votes to convict you and remove you from office. Andrew Johnson was 1 vote shy from getting removed from office. Nixon would have been, and Bill Clinton wasn't quite that close, but I can't remember how close he was, but he did not have enough votes to remove him from office. Yeah.
So is impeachment different than being removed from office?
Yep. So we would say that we have had 2 presidents impeached. They were not, neither one were removed from office. Nixon never got to that point. Johnson and Clinton both went through the impeachment. They both survived the impeachment. They did not have enough votes to remove them. So it all depends on the Senate and how they vote as to whether or not they get removed. And that's a really important understanding because many people don't understand the process. They just believe impeachment means you get thrown out of office. It's more of a legal process there. So there are a few executive powers here when it comes to Congress. The Senate has to confirm all presidential appointments. I think we've mentioned that previously. The Senate also has to approve all treaties that are made by the president or by the House of Representatives if they are making those treaties. So any of those treaties that are negotiated, I think most commonly of Woodrow Wilson and his his League of Nations that he was trying to promote. He made that treaty at the end of World War I, comes back home, thinks he's got everybody to support it, and all of a sudden they don't. And he goes around and campaigns for it for 2 years to the detriment of his health, leading to a stroke, which most historians and doctors believe that his stress over trying to get congressional approval on this treaty was what led to that stroke, and he never was the same again. And then finally here, they have the power to investigate certain items. The only reason I really include this was because this happened relatively recently, within the last 10 or 15 years, regarding Major League Baseball. Now, Congress uses this power in many other ways, but for me, paying attention to sports, this is the one that makes it most real. They brought in a bunch of Major League Baseball players when there was controversy over the use of steroids in baseball. And they had guys sitting in front of these congressional committees asking them questions, asking these pro baseball players, guys like Mark McGwire and trying to think who else was in there. Curt Schilling, I think, was brought in there. Some of these guys that are going to be in the Hall of Fame are already there in the Hall of Fame, asking about their use of steroids and whether or not it was happening. Because they were trying to draw public attention to the problem and perhaps gather enough information to determine whether they wanted to put into law certain legislation regarding performance-enhancing drugs. And it made national headlines. It was all over SportsCenter, all over the national news. And it came down to making a decision that, well, this is more of a baseball issue. As long as they are going through the appropriate medical channels, we don't want to eliminate this from the general public use because there were some legitimate uses for it. So they determined they were going to let baseball handle it, and baseball determined how they wanted to proceed. But there are actually a couple of guys who got themselves in big trouble because they lied in front of Congress, and you can go to jail for that. Can't remember the guy's name, but Rafael Palmeiro was one of those. He ended up not going to jail, but people were